Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the lecture for 7.1 and 7.2. It's the last part of the chapter with biodiversity, and we're going to look at some causes and effects of global change, how our climate is changing, and how that then overall affects our biodiversity. So first thing we're going to talk about is what's called our ecological footprint. And you might have heard this before, but when we talk about our carbon footprint or our ecological footprint, what we're really looking at is the total area of healthy land and water that each individual needs to provide the resources that you use. So we're looking at what we need for food, what we need for water, what we need for energy, all of that land that we need to go ahead and provide those resources that we use every day. So that's looking at really what our footprint is on our atmosphere and on our biosphere. Now, when we look at the national average of ecological footprints, okay, it's quite different when we look at some different continents. When we look at South America, you'll see that all the green, that's showing very little ecological footprint. However, when we look at the United States and North America, okay, United States specifically has 4 times the ecological footprint compared to other areas across our global average. Okay, and if we look at areas in Europe, we see that obviously they have some higher numbers as well, but everywhere else across the world has much, much lower numbers of ecological footprint. So that again just kind of goes along with the idea of how much Americans use and how much we consume and how much we need. And really we'll see kind of what that effect has on biodiversity overall in the next few slides. So something that happened in the 1950s and what we've talked about since last chapter is the Industrial Revolution, okay? And we look at what's called the Great Acceleration. So around 1950s, when we really started seeing that exponential growth after the Industrial Revolution, okay, we also, because the world's population was increasing so much, we also saw how much energy was needed. We saw how many crops were needed, so the amount of fertilizer being used, how much water was being needed. So all these other resources that were being needed more because of the fact that our world's population was increasing so much. Okay, so we looked at things like over-harvesting species, over-hunting. We looked at the way land was being used, all these things having this effect because of this great acceleration. Okay, burning fossil fuels increased, farming increased, fertilizer increased, everything started increasing as the population became larger and larger because we were needing more and more resources to support that many more people. Now, when we look at the cause of this and what ended up resulting in it, okay, how some of our activities affected our global systems, okay, we look at how the atmosphere has changed and how that resulted in climate change. We look at how the way land is being used, over-harvesting or over-hunting of species. We look at how invasive species has changed our biosphere. We look at how pollution has changed our biosphere. All these different things, because of our increasing human population, has caused a lot of stress on organisms and in their ecosystems. And that overall is threatening the biodiversity, causing a lot of animals to go to become on the endangered list and even possibly go extinct, and kind of what that overall effect has on our biodiversity. And in turn, as biodiversity then becomes threatened, it hurts us as well because we saw how many benefits we get from having a diverse amount of species. Now, changing atmosphere and climate. So when we look at a couple bits of data, okay, first big thing with data is that the atmosphere's carbon dioxide levels have heavily been increasing since the Industrial Revolution. No surprise compared to what we talked about in Chapter 5 and the effect the Industrial Revolution had. Also, the second bit of data that's very important is that most of this carbon dioxide is coming from the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, so all of the different pollutions that are being put out with the creation of energy and the car pollution and things, all of that is adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because that's burning our fossil fuels. It's giving us our energy. Now, 2 things that are resulting from that. First one is climate change. So climate change is where we start to see these measurable long-term changes in our climate. So we see changes in temperature, clouds, wind, precipitation, and frequency of extreme weather events. So whenever we start to see these averages change over a long period of time, that's causing the climate to overall change. And if the climate changes, realistically, we're looking at if those organisms can still live in that habitat with that climate. If it changes too much, they might have to move or they might go extinct. Now, the other part is global warming. Okay, global warming directly deals with the increased average of temperature across the biosphere. Now, how this happens is we have what are called greenhouse gases. Okay, greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, as they increase and they are in the atmosphere more and more, those greenhouse gases, what they do is they trap the heat, okay, coming from the sun. And as they trap the heat, that causes global warming. It causes an increase in temperatures across the biosphere, across the atmosphere. Okay, so as we have more greenhouse gases, such as CO2, okay, that is going to trap more and more of the heat instead of letting it go back in and out of the atmosphere. Instead, it traps it and causes an increase in overall temperature. Now, the next thing we're going to go ahead and look at is what these threats and how they affect biodiversity. So human activity today is really causing the greatest wave of extinctions. We've seen current rate of species loss approaching about 1,000 times what the normal rate is. So we're really seeing a lot more species go extinct a lot faster than we ever have before. And the problem is as species disappear, the contribution that they may be able to give us is going, unknown. We don't really know what they may have been able to provide, what benefits they may have been able to provide to our lives. So as they go extinct, we really don't know much about them, and we don't really know what things in their genes are lost and what may have been able to help us. So some different threats to biodiversity. So obviously a big one that we just talked about is climate change. And like I had said, if the conditions change enough beyond the organism's tolerance of where they can actually live and be able to survive, the organism has two options. They either need to move to a different area that is more suitable, that has a better climate, or unfortunately, which is more common, they end up facing extinction. So with that climate change, if the climate changes too much to get them out of that tolerance range where they can survive best, their only option is to either move or unfortunately face extinction. Now, deforestation is another threat to biodiversity. Just like it sounds, deforestation is the loss of forest, okay? Us cutting down those forests for our uses. Now, healthy forests have a lot of benefits to us. It helps protect fresh water. The forests are able to absorb excessive carbon dioxide because, as we learned, plants and trees take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So they actually help decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So the more trees we cut down, the bigger increase of CO2 we see. Okay, so deforestation really ends up causing our CO2 numbers to continue to rise instead of helping maybe take them down a little bit. Trees also help moderate the climate. So the more trees we take down, then the larger climate change we may see. Okay, this is in 1620, the amount of forest that we had, and then this is 1920. Obviously now, and if we were to look at those numbers today, it's probably even fewer. So there's a lot of deforestation, not only in our country, but across the world. All right, now development and urbanization. So as our societies develop and as we see more and more people move into the cities and the suburban areas, we need to go ahead and build up those areas more. They need more houses, they need more resources. So habitat loss, urbanization just causes housing and building developments to go ahead and take away those natural habitats that were previously there and what organisms previously lived there. So we pretty much knock down those areas, build what we want, and whatever was there previously is gone, and causing those organisms to either leave or die. So that urbanization, giving more city life or suburban life, and developing that housing and buildings and things is really taking away a lot of the areas that other organisms need. Habitat loss goes along with that as well, and fragmentation. So habitat loss is just when natural habitats are completely changed. And again, species only have two options. They either move and find somewhere else, or they end up dying. So that's really their only two options. And unfortunately, with us taking away a lot of those habitats, they don't even have really many places to live. Habitat fragmentation, the word fragment means to go ahead and separate. So habitat fragmentation causes biodiversity loss because what we do is we make ecosystems much smaller than what they used to be. So we might have an area of land that is a whole ecosystem. And what habitat fragmentation is when we go ahead and we separate it and kind of fragment it into like these little islands. And we might go ahead and build houses here. We might go ahead and build a mall here. Okay, we might go ahead and have some shopping here, some little shopping centers and grocery stores and things. And then the only habitats left are these areas here. Okay, so all of the organisms need to move into just those areas that are now available where before they had this big ecosystem. So that's what habitat fragmentation is. It really reduces the habitat and makes them much more vulnerable to problems and biodiversity loss. Now, hunting. So humans, obviously, we know that humans hunt, and humans can hunt almost pretty much a species to the point of extinction. Now, why we hunt? Okay, we hunt for meat, we hunt for food, but we also are hunting for hides and skins and things that are worth a lot of money. So we also are looking at exotic animals that are hunted to be sold then as pets. So obviously those things are more dangerous and pushing species to extinction than simply just hunting for food resource. There is a group, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, where they've actually banned complete international trade for any type of endangered species. So there's no trade, there's no product being made for any animal that is on the endangered species list. Okay, and again, endangered species is any organism that is at risk of extinction. So it is illegal to go ahead and hunt anything that is on the endangered list. It's illegal to try to sell something as a pet that is on the endangered list, to go ahead and try to help preserve those animals and let those organisms hopefully bounce back and not go extinct. Now, invasive species, those are organisms that are introduced to a brand new habitat. And unfortunately, a lot of invasive species are brought to their new habitat by us. Okay, a lot of times human trade and travel cause this to happen, and not always intentionally, but sometimes it is intentionally. So the problem is when we bring a new species into a brand new habitat, okay, they become invasive or they grow exponentially because at that point when they come into this brand new habitat, they're able to kind of take over resources and go ahead and kind of take over where maybe native older organisms were living, and they have kind of unlimited resources at that point and can grow really fast and really aggressive and take over and kind of push out these native organisms. So invasive species, we bring these new organisms into the environment and they kind of take over, they grow exponentially, and we can't really stop them from that. A very common invasive species in this area are what are called zebra mussels. They were brought in through trade and they attached themselves to boats and things, and kind of were just brought in through the trade process. So it wasn't something intentional, but they have grown invasively in many areas. And what happens is they clog up like boat motors. They go ahead and clog up piping systems and things and can cause a lot of issues. There's these little mussels that they grow so fast and reproduce that they kind of take over the whole area. So that's kind of what an invasive species is. And again, it kind of pushes out all the native organisms that used to live there. And that's where we see that threat to biodiversity. Pollution. So we know pollution isn't good. We know that it can hurt organisms. So many pollutants can actually threaten biodiversity by killing off some of the organisms. A perfect example is this insect spray that was used back in the day. It was called DDT. Okay, and what it did was it was used as an insect spray. However, birds that were exposed to it prevented them from laying healthy eggs, and they were no longer able to reproduce healthy organisms So we saw a big decrease in their numbers. DDT is now actually banned. It cannot be produced anymore and be sold, but it was a major pollutant that caused a lot of issues. Fertilizer is also another problem. When we see fertilizer being sprayed over crops, but then it might run off into a lake or a stream, and it's polluting those waters, and we sometimes see those fish or other organisms using those waters. They can sometimes have some dangerous effects as well. Other pollution, increased carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. That's producing stronger acidic rain. And that can go ahead, and that higher acid amount in our rain and in our oceans and lakes, that can go ahead and threaten our marine ecosystems. Okay, it puts some stress on the land and the water organisms that live near that water. Now, the last thing we're going to look at are some conservation efforts. So all these threats to biodiversity, all these things that we're doing that are killing organisms, putting them on the endangered list, making them move to different areas, all these things that are threatening biodiversity. There is an effort going to try to help conserve and kind of go ahead and reverse some of the effects that we've done. So one of the big things is we've identified what are called ecological hotspots. Hotspots are areas that have significant number of species and habitats that are in danger of extinction. So we've identified these areas as being kind of really on the danger list, and we've put in extra effort to hopefully go ahead and reverse some of those effects so that we don't see that level of extinction start rising. Something else we're doing is what's called a captive breeding program or a species survival plan. This is where we start to see different organizations and zoos and things. They start mating pairs of animals together to go ahead and try to ensure genetic diversity and to ensure those numbers of that organism to increase. And then the whole goal is to go ahead and get them back into the wild then. So we hope to be able to reintroduce those animals and organisms back into the wild once we go ahead and get those numbers back up a little bit. The last thing that we're doing to help conserve some of the damage is habitat preservation. So we have governments and conservation groups that have set aside areas that are national parks and reserves and things that people cannot go ahead and start cutting down. They can't go ahead and change anything about the habitat, and it helps preserve a lot of that biodiversity. So we're not pushing organisms out of their habitats anymore. So kind of more protected national parks and forests and things that we've set aside that nobody can really touch, so that hopefully that keeps some of those species from going on to the endangered list and ultimately going extinct. So there are definitely some conservation efforts going on, and hopefully we start to see that reverse a little bit and not see so many species going extinct at such a high rate. But those are kind of all the different threats, why we see them being a threat, those global changes that we've done, and what conservation efforts we're doing. So hopefully that covers the material pretty well. Make sure you ask questions if you have them.